Hello, class. I wanted to do a little bit of a wrap up on the presentations, and I wanted to touch on the topics that were often being used to address the low enrollment. Now, this is not a criticism of the ideas that were brought forth. This is what is in the literature. But what I wanted to share was my personal experience as well as those that I have worked with at the project management level, and supply, like I said, a little bit of realism to the difficulties and the challenges that can come with trying to implement some of these ideas. So I'm going to go through these and I'm going to just touch on them. Otherwise, this video will be hours long. So if there are questions that come up as a result of this video, by all means, you feel free to reach out to me as you know that you always can. So ICF, reducing the grade level. Good idea. Like I said, very common thought as to how to do that. Not so easy to actually implement. When you're trying to reduce the grading level from, say, 11th grade or 12th grade down to 8th or 6th, it's not something that a routine project manager or scientist can do. Otherwise, they would have done it right out at the start. Nobody goes into writing an ICF going, you know what? I want to be sure that I write this at a high enough level that it's going to reduce the number of people that can be entered into the study. It's a skill set that I tried to outsource a number of years ago. I've actually tried this twice. It's been a number of years, and so maybe it's changed, but it was very expensive and took time to do, because it's not just a question of looking at some scientific terms and trying to reduce it down to an elementary grade level. It's not that easy. It's how things are written. It's very complex, and like I said, it can be very expensive. Worth trying, but just keep that in mind if you do. The number of pages, there are the reason that ICFs are frequently in the 20s, 20 pages long, 30 pages long, is not because people want to put in more stuff than is required, but because there are required elements. And for those of you that know this, forgive the bringing it down, but not everybody has the same level of exposure or experience. So there are requirements such as the benefits, the background on the information, confidentiality, exactly what the expectations are, and not only are they regulatory requirements, but sometimes there are also requirements of policy from the company that you work for. Those are going to be fewer. The vast majority of them are going to be coming from regulatory agencies, and putting all that information together results in a hefty ICF. So the idea of just simply cutting it in half or reducing it significantly is very difficult, if not impossible. I've seen it tried before, and sometimes if you're lucky, you can reduce it by a page or two, which is not it's not going to change anybody's mind. What you can do, and what some of you came up with or introduced as an idea. Now, I haven't seen this enough, but I think it's a very good idea. And that is having a supplement to the ICF. So you pull out about enough information for, 4 pages, 5 pages, something along those lines. The things that that we believe that the subject is going to be most interested in knowing. What are they getting paid? What are the requirements? When are the visits? Things like that. Contact information if they have problems or questions later on. And now they have to sign both documents, but it gets to the meat of the problem. And if you want to, you can also reduce that to an 8th grade level, and obviously far fewer pages, and much so it's going to be much easier to do and much cheaper. Now, when you're submitting this to a central IRB versus a local IRB, there is no putting pressure on the IRB to do something faster because you have a timeline to meet. They do things on their timeline, and if there's no pressure in them, the only thing that you can do is find out, when you turn something in. So let's say that you can turn something in on Monday, so that way it meets the Thursday meeting. Those are the timings that you need to, because if you turn it in on Tuesday, say you're going to miss that meeting for that week, and it's going to have to go to the next one, and there is nothing you can do about it. Especially with a document like this, it's always going to go to a full board meeting. There is no expediting because of the critical nature of it. Translations. translations are a good idea, but you have to find out if they're actually going to be utilized. I was working for a company not long ago who wanted to have not only well. Actually, let me back up a little bit. The investigator, one of the investigators, said, "Listen, I've got a significant Spanish-speaking population. Is there any way that I can get, say, the ICF translated?" Said, and the sponsor said, "Sure." But what ended up happening is that there's a number of tools, that is, like questionnaires that have been validated in English, and it's not so simple to simply translate those questionnaires into, in this case, Spanish, because they also have to be validated into whatever language you want them translated into. And so that takes a lot of time, and also can be a significant, I guess significant is relative. It's an expense, and it can be a fair amount to do that. A translation may take you a week or two, whereas a validation, and that is ensuring that what is being asked in English is accurately being portrayed, in this case, in Spanish, because you all have all heard the phrase "lost in translation." Well, that's, strangely enough, a real thing, and that can't be allowed to happen with a tool, because now you're defeating the purpose of it. And it became very difficult to find these tools actually being translated and validated in Spanish. And so I went back to the investigator and I asked them, "So are these genuine Spanish speakers that cannot understand enough English to be consented, or was this something that you thought might be nice to have because they speak Spanish and it would be a good thing to have?" And he actually came back and went, "Well, as I'm thinking about it, no, they all know enough English." So that exercise of trying to get everything in Spanish was for naught, and the idea was dropped immediately. And all that expense, none of it had to be done, because we went back and found out exactly what was needed. And I cannot stress that enough. Of a lot of these problems, and I'll jump to the next one. I was looking at my list of things and I'll jump to the next one. You have to actually find out what is the source of the problem. Do not make assumptions like that translations are what we need and we absolutely need it. Do you actually need it? Because, like I said, this was a perfect example. It was a real thing. This just happened a number of months ago. So what was the next thing that I was going to do, which was, what was it? Other trials being conducted. As part of the scenario, there were 12 other trials that were being conducted at the same time, and that was supposed to be impeding possible enrollment in your study. And on the face of it, it would seem that there would be some interference. But again, if you explore down, if you drill down, you ask questions, you find out how many of those sites are actually doing it, you may realize that it's not going to be any interference at all. Maybe. But you only know that by asking the questions. So you have to see if you can gain access to the inclusion-exclusion criteria, because if they're very different from your study, well, then you've got two different populations from which you're going to draw from. They may both be asthma patients, but if the criteria to bring a subject in are completely different, they may not interfere at all. Another big thing, are your sites actually participating in those studies? Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. Now, if you find out that your study and another study actually have very similar inclusion-exclusion criteria and similar enough that a site would be forced to choose between, all right, so they have a subject and having to decide where they're going to go, then what you need to do is have the site be able to come up with some kind of an algorithm, and I mean very simple, as to what would happen. So you have a subject come in, assuming that they qualify for both studies, they will go into study A. A second subject comes in, they qualify for both studies, this time they're going to go into study B. It's as simple as that, but it has to be discussed and actually agreed to at the site level with the sponsor that that's exactly what's going to be done. Tracking enrollment, extremely important. Sometimes I'm surprised that with all the technology that exists to be able to track who's coming in, who's going out, exactly what what CRFs are being completed and what not in very real fashion. Sometimes companies don't have the infrastructure to do so. If they have if they outsource to a CRO, there's a very high probability that that's exactly what will happen. But that comes with a cost. I actually had lunch with a friend of mine a number of months ago, another project manager, who told me that a sponsor came to him wanting, not having enough money to really do much of anything, and asking if they could use paper CRFs. Everybody was sort of taken aback and said, well, we can do that, but you are, you're going to be having the abilities that existed back in the 90s, so to speak, and you won't be able to track very much in real time. Somebody actually has to go out to the site to be able to collect information, pull those pages. It's a lot slower, a lot less efficient. It is less expensive, but that's what they wanted, and that's what they got. So then later on, when they asked for a list of all of the adverse events that had occurred, it wasn't as simple as pulling up and running a report out of the ECRF. They had to actually spend time and money to collate all of that, put that together for a report, which took a considerable amount of time, days, if not a week, to put all of that together and send it to the sponsor. So there's that sort of thing is always a double-edged sword. Risk mitigation plan. This wasn't anything that was discussed, but I thought it was a good idea to bring this up because when we're talking about whether or not somebody's going to need advertising, what happens when you have a low enrollment, none of this should come as a surprise. If, as a PM, at the very beginning of the study, you get core members of your team together and you start to develop what should be called and what I've always known as a risk mitigation plan. So what are the things, and essentially what you do is you come up, what are the things that can go wrong? What's the probability they're going to go wrong? And if they do, what is the impact? So is it going to be high? And then you attach a high, medium, low. There are different ways of being able to do this. But let's say if the idea comes up medium, that there's a fair likelihood that it's going to happen and it'll have a fair level of impact, then you need to come up with a plan to mitigate the impact. So one of these things is always low enrollment. And what are going to be the reasons for low enrollment? You discuss that, and depending on what the reasons are, these are the plans that we're going to have. So that way they are ready to go, and you're not spending time trying to come up with what sort of advertising program are we going to develop for in this scenario. It'll already be, at least you'll have a skeleton plan in place and ready to go and be rolled out as you start to see enrollment dropping, and not after it's already hit rock bottom because you spend all this time doing that. Let's see, the graphs. Always, what's happened with some of these graphs, what I saw happen was that sometimes the location points indicate, for those of you who don't know, so you've got your y-axis and your x-axis, and you've got all of these location points, the little areas that say so. Common location points on the x-axis is going to be time, so January, February, March, April. Those are your location points, and then 100, 200, 300 on the y-axis. Two things: be sure that those exist, because otherwise you just got squiggly lines in between, in half a box, and it doesn't make any sense, and it looks unprofessional. I understand that there may have been some difficulties, but some of those things should have been sorted out. But anyway, that aside, second point, make sure that the different types of lines that you have in your graph are all included in the keys. Something that I saw that was not included or that was missing in a lot of people's, you've got red dotted lines and blue dotted lines and that sort of thing. Make sure that you've got, so the blue dotted line in your key as part of the graph, the blue dotted line is, your red dotted line is. Because when that's missing and you're presenting that, people are going to be looking at each other and go, what is that red line? What is that blue dotted line? The other thing, and lastly, at the bottom, when you're looking at enrollment, if your location time points are so small, or your time numbers, so if you start at 0 and then your first time point or location point is 100, uh, and you are talking about the differences in tens, you're not going to be able to really see at the very bottom any significant jump. It's going to be so small it's meaningless to the naked eye, and so you have to be a little thoughtful as to how you're going to put that together. I know that there was what was it, a format that was provided, and it may have been very difficult to work with, so I didn't take off any points for something like that. But in a real life situation, a senior manager is going to look at that, and again, it's not going to have enough meaning to it. So just keep an eye on that. Protocol amendments, like everything else, be very, very thoughtful. We, when this scenario was being put together, we made it obvious that maybe there should be a protocol amendment. It was just another option to put something together. But in reality, again, alongside of a risk mitigation meeting, before anything is finalized, and that includes the protocol, take a look at every one of your inclusion-exclusion criteria and ensure that they are actually needed. What is the value of this? What are you looking for every one of them? Because I can tell you that oftentimes these inclusion-exclusion criteria are just cut and paste from old protocols. Because it's a similar, sometimes it's just a follow-up study, and these things are carried over. And while it may have had value on a previous study, it won't necessarily have value on this study. And it just for the sake of, I don't know what speed, they're just included. And it can add, all it does is add a level of unnecessary complexity to your protocol. So be sure that every one of them is looked at and discussed, and as simple as it may be. Sometimes I've seen things like they need to have a urinalysis, and that's just a quick example off the top of my head. Well, what is there a real purpose to this? What are you looking for? What if it's positive? Is that going to impact whether or not the subject is eligible for the study? Those are the types of questions that need to be asked and answered, and everybody agreed that it is acceptable for that inclusion or exclusion criteria to remain. Advertising, I have found that the best advertisers are the people who know best about what works. The experienced sites are going to know what works best at their site. You can provide them with information. You can provide them with all kinds of little things. Some of you guys had some great ideas that I very much like them. I've used them in the past. That just you have to have a level of experience that we've seen it before in order to include it. So things like what we call many protocols, or your time and events schedule, laminated cards that physicians and nurses can put in the pockets of their lab coats, all kinds of things like that. Posters and information to post inside of their offices. Very inexpensive, but can be very effective. Like pamphlets for that address why would you want to participate in a clinical study, general things like that. Remember, anything that a potential subject might see has to go through an IRB and receive IRB approval. Something else to keep in mind if you are at a site or a project manager, advice to give to a site is if they're developing their own ad or their own pamphlets, that it come to the sponsor first before it goes to the IRB. More often than not, your sponsor is going to be more strict on the requirements that in that advertising than the IRB is. The IRB is just going to make sure that it's not coercive and it makes sense. Whereas a sponsor's, one of the concerns is that it's so general that, at least one of the concerns, there may be others, well, I'm sure that there'll be others, but the major one that I always was concerned about, that it's so general that it can be used for multiple studies, and every single sponsor is going to end up paying for that ad. So you want it to help your study, not be general and just bring subjects in for research in general. What senior management wants in their slides at the very end. And again, we didn't give costs, and so I didn't have high expectations of people actually applying numbers to this. But having said that, they want to know exactly what the addition, any and all additional resource, how is that changing? So they want to know about money, a broad breakdown of what that money is going to be going to, additional people. Sometimes, if you're working with a CRO, that's going to involve a change in scope. The change in scope is going to have a breakdown of exactly what being made there. Again, that's something that you may want to provide, and any additional personnel internally. Some companies, some sponsors actually attach a cost to personnel that are participating on your study, even though they're salaried personnel. Let's say for AstraZeneca, they want, and I don't know that AstraZeneca does this. I've never worked for them, but let's say that AZ has you're borrowing somebody to help you out because it's slow on that study. They may attach a cost to that, whereas say GSK does not. And but you still want the senior management to know that you're borrowing somebody for a defined period of time. And I guess that's one last thing. When you're doing presentations, just be aware, and I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it very quickly again. Just speak to the slides. I know that we all, sometimes to avoid nervousness, we memorize what we're going to be saying, but then and it becomes a little robotic, and it is, wow, it can sometimes, and not that anybody did it, but I have seen it before, it can get very droning, and if you've got a lot to present, you're going to be putting yourself to sleep in addition to everybody else in the room. So speak to them. Speak to the slides. Talk about what's going on rather than focusing so much on the memorization. One last thing, and this is why I'm holding this. When you're doing presentations also, and of course nobody did this because you didn't have an opportunity to, but pointers, laser pointers are very common. And so avoid doing a lot of this, underlining and circling. Wow, you're going to motion sickness everybody in the room. Remember that such a thing, you don't want what you're adding to be distracting, taken away from what you were saying. Remember, you're the star up there. You're the one that's presenting the information. You're the source of the information. You don't want people looking. I actually found myself looking away from and this guy was a friend of mine. He was a physician. He was presenting. It must have been the first time because it was. And I wasn't the only one looking away because he was doing so much of that. So point and just isolate and don't overdo it. I think that's all I have for the moment. It's already it's been a 20-minute presentation. Sometimes that's a bit long, but a lot of information to cover. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me anytime. And good luck out there.